This week we're going to talk about constructivism or social learning theory. And if you haven't been able to tell by now, I live in this theory with my own teaching. I believe that it offers, this viewpoint offers instructors and teachers so much more to work with and to understand about the learners and to get learning across. I think it's a very important learning theory. Albert Bandura was the first person to think about social learning theory, so he gets the credit. And basically, he began with behavior and thinking and environment are all intertwined, and that learning didn't occur in a linear model, and it was more than just the individual, and that these things were intertwined, and we needed to understand each aspect in order to be able to teach better. He also did a great deal of work with clarifying the mechanism of goals and how people thought about their learning objectives and what they wanted to accomplish. In fact, he has an entire additional theory called self-efficacy theory. And basically, what he found out is that anxiety and stress complicate learning and complicate self-efficacy, and that people who believe they're going to do well and don't worry about not doing well actually end up fulfilling. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the other part of Bandura's theory related to this whole efficacy and self-efficacy bit is that reflection was absolutely an important part of the learning process. If you didn't do reflection and you weren't self-aware of what had happened before or how things might have been done differently, there was no learning that took place. And because of his belief that learning is not linear, these self-regulatory feedback loops of, now what would I do differently? How would I do that next? Are very important to learning. And last but not least, I did mention this, but this whole idea of anxiety and how it interplays with coping and efficacy is a very important part. Anxiety gets in the way of learning, and things need to be done to decrease that anxiety to maximize the amount of learning that can take place. Bruner said, yep, I believe that, but he tended to be more on the cognitive level and said, people learn better, that the outcome of cognitive development is the ability to think, and that individuals must construct their own knowledge and be able to organize it and categorize the information and see relationships in order to have learning actually occur. He was one of the first theorists to say you do not have to reach a certain level in order to be able to learn things, or in other words, it's not a developmental process. You can learn without going through certain phases. And that growth and learning occurs through the interaction between the individual and culture. He did do a lot of work here with how do I manipulate that interaction best, and he did a lot of work with children, so he looked at how that interaction could be done through play. So he came up with the sequence of cognitive coding and said that, in order for information to be put into memory, the brain and the individual has to take that information and log it and organize it in certain ways. And his 3 ways of logging were inactive, learning through movement or action, iconic, learning through images, or symbolic, learning through abstract symbols or language. And that in order to achieve mastery, we have to receive feedback related to these three things, and that feedback combined with how we categorize it is what keeps it in our long-term memory. I think one of the more important aha moments that Bruner came up with is that learning is this continuous process, and that we must spiral our curriculum to create opportunities for discovery learning, because the individual actually manipulating the information to put this coding into the brain, that process, that discovery learning, that problem-based learning is very important. So the fact that discovery learning is often called multiple different things. It could be simulation-based learning, it could be case-based learning, it could be problem-based learning. But the idea that it's embedded and that the experience of manipulating the process is part of the process. And then the other thing with the learning spiral is that Bruner says when students discover it by themselves, it increases their responsibility to learn on their own and motivation to learn more. And so our teaching, our curriculum needs to continually spiral to build upon each other, similar to scaffolding, only he called it a spiral, to build upon each other so that they can learn in bits and pieces. Think cognitive theory. I can only do 4 pieces at a time in my short-term memory. And that this spiral of continually revisiting and reflecting and double loop learning is what makes discovery learning so important. Kolb, we've talked about Kolb before, and Kolb is a big, the big focus of Kolb is on experiential learning. The focus is on the process of learning and the fact that learning takes place within an activity by and through the active experimentation to understand what's going on. So simulation-based learning often uses Kolb as a theoretical framework that says, I'm going to give you a concrete experience. I'm going to have you go into the simulation lab and work with a patient who has CHF and experience what that looks like. You may never have done that in your practice before. After we do that activity, I am going to set up a concrete reflection process where we can think about what did we do, what should we have done, how would we do that differently next time, and hopefully out of that comes the ability to abstractly conceptualize how I can use this information that I learned in this experience in other similar experiences. So kind of that what if learning. You learned about CHF with a fluid overload, and this patient was in stage 1 of CHF. What if it was stage 3? What would we do differently? So this experiential learning cycle takes us through these phases that in turn results in active experimentation. I take what I learn in this concrete, reflective, what if learning situation, and then I actually go out and use it and experiment with it in actual practice. So that the knowledge outcome that we are looking for is actually created through this transformative experience that takes place. Vygotsky, sociocultural theory. Vygotsky took the work of Piaget and said there's something more to this than just how the individual learns, and that it's about individual cognitive development and skill base. There is learning that takes place within a social setting, and that in that social setting, cultural context drives the individual development and makes the individual more curious, wanting new understandings of life, and more in a discovery mode. So this is what he took away from examining children. The two biggest concepts that come out of the Vygotsky sociocultural theory are the more knowledgeable other, or the MKO, in the zone of proximal development. So the more knowledgeable other says part of how we learn and how we have aha moments is by working with someone who has a better understanding or higher ability than we do. And that modeled behavior and coaching is a significant part of the learning process, particularly outside of the classroom. And then the other aha moment that Vygotsky came up with is this concept of a zone of proximal development. And basically what this is you come to the table with your individual skill range. And then you interact with this more knowledgeable other, and you realize that there's more to the situation than you understand or have a skill set to do. So the learning takes place in this zone of proximal development where we can create opportunities for the change process, for the learning process to take place under the guidance of a more knowledgeable other, or under the guidance of peers who have a distributed knowledge base, and that by having experiences where they're uncomfortable and they're with these people who have levels higher than them, that it helps them learn and transfer that independence to be able to do it yourself and improve that skill as a result of that social interaction. So Vygotsky says we learn a lot from observation, that vicarious learning or observational learning does occur, and it occurs by just watching these more knowledgeable people. So along comes Lave and Wenger, and they got together and said learning takes place in a situated setting, and that learning is the result of culture, activity, and context all put together, combined with the individual. So it's the big picture, if you will. And that there are two ways that people learn in this kind of situated learning. One is through a community of practice, and that would be the work of Etienne Wenger. And the other is through legitimate peripheral participation. So that's a big fancy word, LPP, for I learn in the world by participating, and I'm not learning through talking, but I'm learning through learning how to talk the language. And that's part of this immersion in this community of practice. That learning occurs as a function of the activity and the context and culture in which it occurs. And it occurs from a proximal observational mode until you're a full active participant in the community of practice. So in nursing learning, we very much learn this way. And I think the community of practice concept really resonates with me as an instructor, is that we usually learn because we have a joint understanding or a joint theme or purpose that brings us into a communal learning situation. and that part of learning is about building up this trust among the membership, particularly the culture unwritten rules that are happening. We learn through that cultural practice that shapes our behavior, and we don't even realize that we're learning that, or that trust is even part of that, until we sit down to actually say, oh yeah, I remember this teacher and this is why it was so important to me, or I remember my first preceptor and how well they taught me or how well they didn't teach you. When you learn as part of a community of practice, the fact of or the concept of identity formation takes place, and through this identity formation, you actually become transformed to become a member of that community, and you learn, and learning becomes the practice of belonging to the group, engagement in practice with the group, so that the group can share its tacit knowledge as well as their shared practice. And the really interesting part of communities of practice and situated learning is that it isn't just about you learning, but that feedback loop of how you learn and the questions that you ask actually transforms the collective intelligence of the community of practice. The other things that are learned through a community of practice model is that we learn as part of a negotiation of trying to understand the meaning and significance of the experience, and why this is important and why that isn't important. And then eventually we become transformed to understand that implicitly, or intuitive knowledge. And we do that through many years of practice within this community of practice. So I think you can look at nursing learning and see that we very much belong to a community of practice, and our learning takes place a lot like this. Maybe not our formal learning in school, but definitely in the first couple years of practice. This is all the missing pieces that you didn't get in school. And it gives us so much more of a richer perspective of why you do what you do and how you make decisions in nursing, as you become more part of the community of practice. I often will even begin to try and push that identity formation by asking students not to refer to themselves as a student, but to look at themselves as a nurse in practice, a nurse apprentice. But the more that they refer to themselves as a student, it takes them into a mindset where it says, I don't have any engagement in this process, rather than say, I'm a nurse in training, and I am responsible for this identity formation that takes place through this learning experience. It's a much richer learning. So what are the takeaways from sociocultural learning? Is that learning no longer is in the hands of the instructor, that you take a very much more facilitator role rather than a teaching role. So our job as teachers is to clarify and summarize and questions and predict in order to improve the skills practice. Our job is to do this in an immersive and a contextual way, so we don't just tell you, here's what you need to learn, but here's what you need to learn, and here are some very different case-based learnings and problem-based learnings where you're going to take that knowledge and put it into practice. And I know we talk about that a lot in terms of how that plays out on the NCLEX exam, but we need to do a better job in the classroom of doing that. In order to do that, we have to look at our curriculum and look at our moments for scaffolding and make sure they're aligned. Make sure we're not expecting people to go from A to C without building that platform. Make sure we have a reflective practice in how we're teaching, so people can check in and say, well, this was my understanding, and you can say, yes, it is. So feedback is a big piece of this. Again, because we're talking about sociocultural, the group versus the individual, the benefits of peer collaboration and group work at different levels of ability really augment and enhance the development toward independent practice. And last but not least, we really need to understand the sociocultural meanings, and that there are multiple different sociocultural meanings that need to be considered when we're looking at how learning takes place based on our learners' profiles. Last but not least, I thought this was a really cool visual, because I like visuals, of the educator as a maker-educator, and how our role is different, and what are those different pieces of what teaching looks like from a sociocultural perspective, and how we interact with learners as a part of a community of practice.